Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Policy Strategy Academy's PABS webinar series. This is our third in a series that will go until May 2026. And today we're dealing with contracts in context. The content of this webinar is aligned with the current IGWIG track on governance and intersessional informals on contracts that have been held in late November and early December. Before I get into the meat of the webinar and introduce the eminent experts that we have, some housekeeping. First of all, this session will be recorded. The recording will be available to participants in this webinar at a later date after we have done some editing and cleaning up of the video that accompanies it. Extracts and a short note with the resources will then be shared. As you are listening, if you prefer not to listen in English, we have enabled closed captioning and also AI-supported simultaneous interpretation, and you can access that by hitting the More button and following the instructions that follow. We also have a live Q&A, so you can put any questions that you might have for the panelists into the Q&A, and we will deal with those at the close of the presentations from the experts. We have ample time for discussion, and we hope that you will take advantage of it. I am Spring Gombe, your host, and I am joined by Julia Barnes-Weiss, Tom Johnson, and Kwasi Amfo. Julia is the founder and executive director of the Global Healthcare Innovation Alliance Accelerator, known to many of us as GIA. She's a lawyer and certified licensing professional, ex-Glaxo Wellcome Business Development, and former Duke faculty. She has decades of experience in intellectual property and partnership negotiations. Tom is an independent business development and strategy advisor with an MBA from Wharton and more than 25 years of deal-making across biopharma and technology. And Kwasi is the founder and chief executive of Luipard, with over 30 years in pharma and public health across Europe, the United States, Africa, and Asia, including senior roles at GSK Biologicals, Novartis Vaccines and Diagnostics, and Takeda Vaccines. Welcome, all three of you.
Thank you.
All three, you should also know, have advised countries, funders, companies, and universities during the COVID pandemic and worked on the strategy and negotiation of COVID-19 vaccine deals. That experience will be very relevant for our discussion. Julia, Tom, and Kwasi are going to walk us through what belongs in strong agreements, how to read terms before they are signed, what Memorandum of Understanding can and cannot do. And in doing so, they may bring up one or two slides to give you some implementable suggestions. We hope to be very practical. The contracts that countries and companies consider signing now must still work when PABS rules are agreed. They must also comply with international laws such as the International Health Regulations and national laws and institutional consent and ethics requirements. The documents that countries will negotiate include license agreements, Memorandum of Understanding, data access and data use agreements, material transfer agreements, supply contracts, and tech transfer agreements, almost all including confidentiality provisions. In the end, the goal may be deceptively simple: to align all agreement negotiations with the strategies and aims of the country or company you represent. Every clause should be considered as to whether it meets your goals or causes friction points as you work to build long-term capacity at home or in your institution. I'm going to turn over to our speakers now and start with Julia. Julia, you often say policy only counts if it is implemented. So how do contracts do that? Why do contracts matter so much in global health? And in what ways are these agreements different from a normal commercial deal?
Thank you, Spring. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you to the audience members for joining us, in particular, those who are very busy negotiating a whole range of agreements right now. So we particularly appreciate your time in joining us. To answer the question of why agreements are so important, First of all, and apologies to those of you who are lawyers or spend a lot of your time around contracts, because at the beginning this will seem a little bit basic, but they establish the binding rights and obligations that each party has accepted to achieve the objectives of a partnership and provide the mechanism to manage, enforce, and terminate those requirements. Key types of agreements often play a major role in from innovation through research, through development and commercialization. So I will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then, of course, license agreements provide the mechanism for transferring intellectual property to subsequent developers and manufacturers. So that whole sequence of agreements is quite important. And for global health, the normal contracts, if we can call a commercial contract normal, has some differences when you're talking about access to global health products. First, as we, I think, can think about today in particular, the intense sort of scrutiny and the transparency requests around the agreements that impact global health. The balancing of public and private interests, so governments, not-for-profits and universities, and private companies. The private plus public purchaser market, so who's going to buy the products at the end of the day and under which agreements. I think also the expectations regarding profitability of global health products. So what is a fair price? What should be made available at cost versus something that's going to be sustainable later on to a company? Also the role of funders, and again, commercial, not-for-profit buyers. So a lot of the funders in this area are foundational funders who have certain requirements, especially around equitable and affordable and sustainable access. So another word on that in a minute. Pricing terms that can be impacted by those. The importance of liability and indemnification coverage that differ across different countries. And are often needed as an incentive, if you will, for commercial companies to take the risk of providing the products. And then termination provisions trigger a lot of different actions if it is for a global health purpose versus a more normal commercial contract. So how does that impact the current situation where business as usual continues to evolve, but funding's tighter? And getting it right in treaty negotiations, bilateral agreements, and contracts between innovators, developers, and manufacturers who may be impacted is even more important. So I'll stop there, Spring, because I think you have another question for me. Oh,
Sorry, I needed to turn my microphone. Apologies. So where do the public interest, transparency and oversight change what is written and how it can be enforced? Can you show us a map of the common agreement types in this space so that teams know what is coming?
So I think we can put up a slide now. What I was going to show is how partnerships created and managed through this continuum of contracts usually evolve over the life of a product with a public health goal. And therefore, how these can be impacted by what you, the negotiators of all of these types of agreements, agree in treaties, regional agreements, bilateral agreements, and really your normal partnering agreements. You can look at, but I won't talk about that sort of top grade slide, which is just really looking at the continuum. And I think Tom will talk a little bit more about what happens sort of before discovery in a minute. But in R&D funding agreements, these agreements also often include material transfer agreements at the same time. So you'll see the impact of those both from a private perspective and then from a public perspective. So, if the pandemic agreement has certain obligations that a country then accepts and turns into national law, that's going to affect how those material transfer agreements can be entered into in bilateral agreements. Same thing with licenses, both collaborations upstream. So who owns the IP that is leading into what is developed and made available for development into a product? Related to that, of course, license and tech transfer agreements downstream. I'm not going to get into advanced purchase agreements and procurement agreements at this point in time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the funding and the access commitments, since foundational funders are often involved in many of these. Any obligation that a country enters into in advance of this might make it more difficult for a funder to provide funding when they are going to want to have open access, for instance, to data in many ways, certain aspects perhaps not confidential, and certain outcomes. For instance, if there is an agreement with CEPI or Gavi and a certain number of doses have been guaranteed under those agreements, how's that going to be impacted if the pandemic agreement requires certain percentages of doses to be provided, as well as if doses are either received or provided in another way by national governments. So if there's some framework agreements that have been signed with particular countries. So you can see the interrelationship between this, which in a sense is kind of business as usual for global health agreements, and how what you're negotiating now. We've all referred to this, I think, as three-dimensional chess, but I think it's more approaching six-dimensional chess at the moment. You can see how those interact with each other, and the necessity for keeping the goals at the end of the day in mind, both for the countries, well, I should say for the countries, for the innovators such as universities, and for the companies that are going to be developing these, hopefully into a sustainable business model for them to be able to provide and sell products. So the access commitments that will be necessary kind of across all of these need to align. I think, unless you have something else right now, Spring, I think what I'm going to do, the time is tight, and we know that, analyzing your situation and looking both for opportunities and potential friction points is very key for you at present. And I'm going to hand over now then to Tom, because I think he can give you a good illustration and path for how to do that. And then we can return if you have any questions about the interaction of these different levels of agreements later on. So thank you, Spring. And Tom, I turn this over to you.
Thank you, Julie, for the great framing and introduction. A good day to everyone. First slide, please.
Technology may have abandoned us slightly, so we'll just give it another second or so. Tom, apologies about that. There we go.
It's coming up now. Thank you. So given the complex system and the sequence of these global health agreements that could come into play, especially with PABs, and this includes both existing and new related agreements, we suggest starting with a situational review to identify the potential points of friction and the opportunities therein. And this means tracing across the different agreements so-called key terms. I myself typically do that using a visual map as presented here. Those that know me have seen many of these over the decades of trying to understand very complex systems. So first, we start by recognizing the foundational layer here, that all these relationships and agreements rely on that structure provided by the country's national laws, regulations, which often address important requirements such as data privacy, country sovereignty, law jurisdiction, and such. In addition to these items, there are other key terms to track across the various agreements and relationships, and these include intellectual property rights, equitable access obligations that Julie mentioned, which include price, volume, technology transfer, but also liability, indemnification responsibilities, and these are just a few. So from a practical standpoint, if we, for instance, take the view of a country that signs onto PABs and submits material or data into the PABs system for access by other countries, the country has to consider the source of that information and what rights and obligations already apply as it then makes its way through the system to different R&D manufacturers or fully integrated manufacturers. And in this particular case, an instance to consider is where that R&D group further develops the information that came through the system and generates what we call foreground intellectual property. First of all, is that permitted under the country's arrangement with the source of that information? One could consider a surveillance network that is sequencing potential epidemic antigens. So can they do that? Can that then be improved upon? And what happens with it when it is approved upon? Does the country have access to it? Does it flow back and such? I note as well that part of the challenge is that the PABS language is not complete yet. So we've got some drafts, we've got some intent from our situational review of how it should structure so that these things can be accommodated. So furthermore, there are considerations outside of the PABS framework, as noted here, that should be included in the situational review. For instance, if the country has local innovators such as universities or biotechs who are working on technologies that support the country's infectious disease outbreak response and preparedness. In this case, are there concerns about handicapping those innovators by sharing their know-how through the system or other information with countries through bilateral arrangements? Big consideration in terms of innovation, local innovation. As Julie mentioned, there are, of course, other agreements that may generate friction, such as with funders who require certain equitable access, considerations around price, volume, guarantees. Humanitarian licenses exist as well. There are also the DFIs, who in some cases require return on investment. Then we also have regional initiatives that oblige that country to coordinate preparedness efforts with others. So as you can tell, and as Julie mentioned, this is a multi-dimensional chess game. I think the situation is further complicated with many countries now proceeding on new bilateral agreements with the United States as part of the health cooperation strategy. The approach appears to start with a non-binding MOU, then proceeding very quickly to a binding framework agreement that includes some key obligations for the country in return for US funding. Other key terms that we talked about to track are still left to a future agreement for the country in return for that funding, such as specific access to data systems, identifying those systems. It's also notable from my perspective that the actual funding commitments from the US are indicative, and these really cannot be fully confirmed due to the internal budget process for the United States. Therefore, the countries will of course need to consider the lack of specificity in the negotiated agreement with the ability to adjust as those details become available. And as noted earlier, we're now seeing the release of actual signed agreements, MOU and such. These will be quite helpful for subsequent country negotiations. At a higher level, we recommend that countries actually form teams of local and international experts across various key areas to help assess how to make sure the MOU and the agreements are crafted to achieve the intended goals while also adhering to laws, regulations, rights, and obligations, tracking all of those. So one could see also regional groups or civil society organizing similar reviews and offering best practices. All these should be seen as a positive approach in support of the country's self-reliance, which is a key component of the US global health strategy. So for some practical examples of opportunities, we move to the next slide, please. And I will note, these are shown for informational purposes. I'm not a lawyer, and they should not be considered legal advice. But here we've identified several bilateral MOU examples or agreement examples that we would recommend be included in the negotiation and the final agreement. First, we start with a purpose clause. This is to identify very clear what the data sharing is for, and it's only for the purpose of implementing the cooperation agreement and the agreed funding health areas. Next, permitted disclosure clause. This would allow for the country to disclose to partners in support of similar health area initiatives and related agreements. Funding contingency. This is a fairly simple one, but essentially, if data sharing is at all times contingent upon the receipt of the funding as agreed and outlined. And then, importantly, the compliance clause. This would make sure that data sharing is performed in compliance with the applicable country's laws, regulations, and any related agreements that provide for that. I have to mention that as of early this morning, we've seen released signed agreements between Kenya and the United States. We've started to review those. My initial review of those, very high level. Each of these provisions and other things can be accommodated in the agreement. So we'll need to track those, look at those, and develop, again, these best practices. But each of these, I think, is a clear opportunity and achievable given the language we've seen thus far. So with that, I will turn back to Spring.
Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, a lot to take in, very important. A quick question about one other element. I mean, we've heard a lot about, what, say, the United States might want from its partners. Is there anything in the way of reciprocity in demands that countries can make of the United States or any other bilateral partner? And then how do you tie those demands back into a global negotiation?
So again, I'll preface with we need to actually review the actual agreements to determine what is there and what is not there.
Yeah.
And we need a bit of time to do that. My quick review suggests there is some reciprocity available. But we have to understand that the agreement is really to help fund the health initiatives of the country, help them move to a position where they're directly funding things mostly in the future. And in return, they're sharing access to certain information back to the US to help with that, to audit that and such. We'll have to track through how products are made, how products built upon information coming from the country are used, and is there reciprocity back to the country, back to the system, to allow for a worldwide response. That we have to track through. So I don't know yet until we look through that, but it's certainly something very important.
Okay, to be continued. Kazi, Tom has talked a lot about what governments, what countries need to do and take account of. You work between government plans and funders and company R&D plans every day. Could an MOU that brings quick money, that actually addresses real needs, make it harder to build local capacity? How does one keep sight of long-term self-reliance, which Tom alluded to, when a short-term offer looks so attractive?
Yeah, and thank you, Spring, and indeed a good day to all the audience. I think that is a very, very valid question, Spring, in the sense that every situation presents an opportunity, even though there may be challenges as well. So, short-term funding coming from bilateral agreements outside of the global PABs, for instance, it's a major opportunity for countries to use that opportunity to, create systems, build capacity, and indeed support their self-reliance initiatives, if indeed the agreements they are signing are permissible of that. And as Tom said, we yet to get full details of some of these agreements. Early indications suggest that those opportunities do exist. But I may just sort of draw our minds back to the post or immediate post-COVID crisis era where, Africa, because of the lessons learned, was really adamant about being self-reliant in solving their own problems the next time crisis comes around. And with a lot of partners regionally, but also globally, a lot of initiatives have kicked off in that direction. So you really need to look at the balance of the gains from these short-term, even if they stretch over a number of years, funding that it's going to come in, help build some of these health systems in exchange for certain benefits, and balance or weigh that against your long-term goals of, self-reliance and sustainability, as we've alluded to, and make sure that your review of how you enter into this agreement is taking that into account. You also need to be very conscious of the fact that these initiatives begin, as Julia alluded to, with the innovation side of things. Are these agreements suppressing innovators' ability to develop and indeed leverage the IPs that they innovate for? How do you ensure that this is not impeded and will support the growth options and indeed growth plans that a country or a regional body establishes for itself? So I think, it's a question of really ensuring that there is a balance between the two. One is not completely bad and one is not completely good. We know that PAPS, for instance, still has issues that some countries are struggling with. And this could present an opportunity to look at how you deal with that. But on the other hand, you need to make sure that it does not impede your long-term goals.
Thanks very much. Before I ask you your next question, I just wanted to bring Julia back in on the question of enforceability of MOUs and contracts, because that's also one of the things that you have to consider and that you have alluded to in your remarks, Kwazi.
Oh, thanks, Spring. Just briefly, because we certainly have been getting a lot of questions about are MOUs enforceable and when is an agreement enforceable. So MOUs can be enforceable. I think the most fundamental question is whether the parties intend it to be enforceable. And sometimes it will actually say that in the MOU. So you'll see a lot of MOUs that say this is not intended to be enforceable. It's less often that you actually see that phrase in an agreement. And again, it was very shortly before this began that we got the copy of the Kenyan agreements. But surprisingly, there's a paragraph in there that says that agreement, which is on the face of it, a full agreement, is not enforceable. So there's a couple of considerations there in looking at why is that not enforceable, what is still missing in terms of terms, and what is the intent for that agreement. But with MOUs themselves, I think what's important is if all of the elements that would make it enforceable in court, which is really kind of the bottom line judge of whether it's enforceable, if they're all there, if there's an exchange of value, if the terms that the two parties have put in there could actually be enforced, then it is going to be enforceable. So make sure before you sign one that if it did actually turn into an agreement, you accept all of the things that you've agreed to in there, or put the phrase in that it's not enforceable. That's just because I know there's a whole stream of countries still to come that are going to face these MOUs and then again quickly these framework agreements. And we can talk a little bit more about the kind of the nature of the framework agreements later. But I was indeed surprised that it looks like that framework agreement with the US is apparently not enforceable. And we'll try to kind of get to the bottom of that later on. And I don't think we fully have time today, but there's a lot of kind of negotiation strategies around what Tom and Kwazi have already said that we should address when we have time, perhaps in the Q&As. And sorry, Kwazi. Spring, please go ahead.
Sure, no, I think what I'll try and do is bring that back to what Kwazi is talking about. Okay, so countries can put in language that says something is not enforceable, but they're still negotiating as bilateral or multilateral partners. They're sovereign, they're doing it on behalf of the country. But at the end of the day, those who are going to be carrying out whatever is agreed are companies. So Kwazi, I'm going to come back to you. It's all very nice for us to know what countries intend to do or don't intend to do to protect their industry, their academia, and their access to help. But this sounds very confusing if you're a company. What are you supposed to be preparing for? How do you go about it?
Well, again, a very tricky one because the governments, of course, supersede what companies can do whether you're within that country or you're external and you're cooperating with another company, which tends to happen a lot in the health front. And therefore, companies need to be made aware that this is happening. Oftentimes, these conversations happen at the governmental level. The consultation process may or may not work properly, and therefore, before you know, something has already taken place, and it covers what your ability to function or perform. So I think the first thing I would highlight is that there needs to be proper consultation in country, but also with partners outside of the country, so that companies and institutions that are going to be affected by these bilaterals, as an example, are aware and can influence or at least give information that those who are actually negotiating can make use of to protect some of their interests. We've already mentioned, for instance, your ability to leverage IPs that you seek to innovate for. If these are signed away or these are compromised in a certain way, obviously this is going to affect the company's ability to innovate along the lines of the IP that they generate. Also, a lot of these partnerships are underpinned by exchange of, IPs or the trading of IPs and licenses, and they need to have the right protections in place. I think we also need to cast a quick eye over what the regional and sub-regional commitments, sort of that happen within the space. And indeed, if we think of the AU as an example, a lot of the initiatives across the African health platform are regionally based. And you need to have your due diligence done as you sign or negotiate these agreements to make sure that these commitments are still intact in a way that you are able to cooperate regionally. I think Tom, made the point about forming teams and task forces across countries and these within the region to make sure that they can work together. So what that brings out is then your ability to enforce the transparency rules around the agreements that you sign. Because if you cannot share, then it makes it impossible to discuss and cooperate and work together in the way that allows you to preserve the things that you have there already in place. And I think the last point that I will make finally here is that as you pull those together, you need to also think clearly about the fact that this is very quick, very fast. We've seen some agreement being signed already. The language allows you to negotiate further because as you learn more, the opportunities that you miss in consultations with the key partners within your country, within the region, as this become alive during the implementation, you should have the opportunity through the way the language is managed to renegotiate some of these things, because time is of the essence and you may not be able to tackle everything. But having clauses that allow you to, I hate to use the word escape, but escape clauses that allow you to go back and renegotiate and fix some of the things that you may have overlooked is an important element that countries need to look at.
Thanks. So Tom, that sounds like Kwasi's sort of one design choice that improves the ability to manage the implementation of agreements is to have your escape clause. Do you agree that that's sort of the design choice that most improves chances? Are there others that people should consider?
I think it's a good tool. We would also call it sort of off ramps.
Mm-hmm.
An ability to exit an agreement properly, especially where you have undefined things when you go into the agreement. Which systems are we accessing? What types of data are we accessing? All those things, and what is still required of local government laws and regulations. You need to overlay all those and figure them out over time. So if you find you're in a situation where you've not properly defined something and you need to go back and do that, then these clauses will help you do that. So I think off-ramps, having mutual agreement to certain things, updating, certain appendices and such to the agreement are key approaches. And then ultimately we move towards, termination clauses. And again, we need to look at these within the context of the agreements that have been signed with the US in particular and see how those play out.
Thanks. That was actually a question that was put in by a member of the audience. So maybe I take the opportunity to read that now and pose it to you, Julia. Do you have suggestions regarding termination clauses in these bilateral agreements? For example, the template data sharing agreement to be terminated by mutual agreement, whereas the template specimen sharing agreement only requires notice by one party to the other? Or is this factored into the clauses that you have already suggested?
Let me back up 1 second on that question. As Tom and Kwasi just mentioned, you have to think what might come ahead, and none of us have great crystal balls at the moment. But for instance, if the pandemic agreement is signed with obligations for countries to adopt that are potentially in violation, if you will, of things they've agreed under one of these bilateral agreements, that needs to be the occasion for, at least, as Tom said, an off-ramp. So when might a country need to be able to not live up to the one particular obligation that they have in the framework agreement in order to make sure that they're not violating their own country's laws? So that ultimate friction point, if you will, those things interact with termination clauses, because if, for instance, the US government can terminate the funding due to a breach of not supplying certain data or materials or whatever they're supposed to supply in some of these still missing gaps in this agreement, there shouldn't be the ability to terminate all of the funding because there is an inability of the country to comply with that particular provision because the country has now adopted a treaty. So these things are important. As to the particular term or provision, I think the first thing to think about is they should not mirror each other. So what is a fair termination or reasons for termination from, for instance, the US perspective is going to be different, which is, essentially failure to live up to its obligations for the country. For the country, my way of thinking of this is what would already be out of the bag, what cat has already gotten out of the bag. So if you've already had to give data, which potentially does away with, say, some trade secrets that companies could then have used to develop a product around, then that has damaged, the ability of that particular country to create sustainable, say, manufacturing and supply in its country. So, what the US can impact then is pulling the funding in the middle of something, from one perspective, but the other perspective is the data that the country might have wanted to keep confidential or available first or at the same time for its own companies may have already left. So that is more, what is the impact of that? And so what do you want to terminate and when, versus when do you want to have a change of conditions in the agreement, sort of an off-ramp, or if you will, a diversion, because what's actually happened is not something that makes you want to terminate that agreement, but to recognize that the other party's really been harmed by it. So that's all to say, I don't think there is one term, one particular agreement term that works for both parties in all of these situations. And so when you might need to get out, what might happen when you just want to change or have one particular obligation omitted is different. And you have to think through each of those possible situations when you're thinking through what do you want to put out there? When would you want to get out? When would you want to change it? What happens if they want to get out? What are the implications of that? So I'll stop there. You could do a webinar on that probably.
And we might just, but
Spring and
since we're
Julia,
yeah,
just
please
a
come
quick,
in.
just a
Yes.
quick point on the termination, because we've dealt with this before, Tom, Julia, if you remember. We're dealing with health here, and all of these programs, or even if you go back to the research point, these things run over several years in some cases. And if you've had an agreement that is providing funding to, let's say, clinical trials, an example, you cannot halt the clinical trial in the middle of things. So making sure that these termination clauses or off-ramp clauses ensure that things like clinical trials or some sort of project work that isn't ongoing needs to be continued until they get to a reasonable end where it can be closed off are very key areas that need to be looked at, because you don't want funding to stop at midway. That would harm patients.
Thanks. Yeah, there are some serious ethical ramifications of that. We got into the lingo, and now I'm thinking about emergency brakes. So there's your standard, I want to get out. But what happens in the case of a public health emergency of international concern or a regional concern, where it's really imperative for you to sort of take national or regional security first before anything else? I don't know who wants to take that first. Kwasi, maybe go ahead.
I'll make a quick comment on that, because I was actually going to talk about that.
Yeah.
And that is, a lot of countries, I can't say for all, do have national security protections, which include biosecurity and health security. And indeed, for most cases, they do override all other sort of agreements or all other commitments that they make. And they can activate that in times of crisis, for instance. So it's very, very important that as part of the due diligence, and indeed as part of the negotiations, these national laws or national protections are embedded in the agreements. And I was glad to see a quick scan of the Kenyan agreement that's referred to local laws, although the details are not in there. Whether something is missing, this is a good point to make sure that it's covered. Critically, what I wanted to also emphasize on this is, if you don't have everything in place at the moment, then it should be possible for you to negotiate such that when those laws are eventually passed, they do have effect there and then on the commitments that you are making, because these are your national security laws and they cannot be superseded by other forms of agreements that you sign. So making sure that the language reflects the fact that some of these things are not in place, they may come into place in the future. And when they do come, they do take effect and overrides some of these commitments, especially in times of emergency, are important clues to think about.
Thanks very much, Kwasi. Tom, I saw you nodding. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Kwasi covered it very well. The additional point I would make is that I think we have to accept and assume that country first priorities will emerge. We saw that during COVID-19. The US did it, others did it. It's a natural reaction to protect your citizens first. With that in mind, the way we design systems and the sharing of materials and the redundancies and the resiliency built into that system should help to offset some of that effect. An example would be setting up, if the WHO has what they consider a participating manufacturer that would receive these samples and data and go to production to make a vaccine, let's say. Doing that within a country that has a small population would be an attractive feature, right? Because you assume they're going to take care of their citizens first, but after that, they can export. There are dimensions that you can build into the system that account for that preference to serve their own citizens first. And we just have to accept that that will be part of the system.
Okay, thank you. Julie, did you want to add anything, or can I go to the next question?
Very quickly, just to make that point again, that when these things happen, we need to expect that in the terms of the agreement. So a lot of times it will just say that, certain kinds of emergency situations will mean that the parties don't have to perform their obligations under the agreement. But again, back to what happens then to the rest of the agreement. And still a little bit troubled by the funding being a shorter number of years than the obligations to provide data and to cooperate in the framework agreement. So need to make sure that what you expected to get doesn't vanish just because your country cannot comply with a particular provision because it's in the middle of an outbreak and has to turn its priorities to other things. So thanks.
Thanks. I think this question, which is from Preeti Patnaik at Geneva Health Files, maybe comes back to you first, Julian. I think you touched on it, Tom, as well, so please come in. Will countries be able to track how their shared biological or DSI information is used by, in this case, the US government?
Hi, Preeti, and I should thank you first for all the really helpful materials that you publish. So thank you for that. Do you mean, is it in the agreement, or do you mean, should they? I think there's a number of things that need transparency. What's been shared, what's been committed to, both in the pandemic agreement terms, for instance, the tracing of when materials go to which parties, and then when do they, I guess in my language at least, sub-license then to a further developer or a manufacturer. Unless you can see who has access to what, and you'll never have a complete picture of that because there will always be bilateral agreements with confidentiality clauses. But until you have a complete picture of that, it is very difficult to know who has the abilities to perform, and so therefore who to partner with, whether it's WHO thinking about that, whether it's the first recipient of materials thinking about that in terms of who they're then going to license it to, who do they need to have as a participating manufacturer, and then when do you have enough? When have you got enough companies making enough of a particular kind of pandemic product that you can A, make it sustainable by somebody purchasing those, and B, know that you have a backup plan if a particular country or company can no longer export those products. So I hope I answered the question, but whether those things are going to be in PABs and in the pandemic agreement, and whether those things are going to be in these framework agreements or acknowledge those remains to be seen. Since the US is not participating in the pandemic agreement negotiations, it is really necessary to hold up what they're asking for versus what's likely to come out for the obligations in the pandemic agreement. Anyway, hope I answered the question. Thanks.
Thanks. Kwasi, do you want to see your thinking hard? I don't know if you want to comment on that or if...
No.
Okay.
Okay.
And
Spring,
Tom,
I could just comment
Sure.
from the U.S. agreement standpoint. Having again quickly looked at the cooperation agreement, there are allowances and considerations around intellectual property rights, and in some cases requiring the consent of the country providing that is then potentially sublicensable to another entity. So in that particular case, with a country sharing information that the US would use to hand off to a manufacturer to respond to a pandemic, it would appear there are some provisions in the Kenyan agreement to allow for consent rights to do something like that. So that would provide what I thought the question was asking, some traceability. Following that original data or information back through the system, making its way to another manufacturer. So I believe there are some provisions in there to do that.
And Tom, Spring, sorry, you said I was thinking.
Please, yes, go ahead.
Something just come up from Tom's comment, and that is this traceability. In the same way, the ability to allow these IPs to be used, usually one needs to look out for the language that is associated with the permissible use of the IPs, and that certain restrictions, for instance, Julia at the beginning made the point about, some funders actually demanding access rights and in some cases pricing restrictions and stuff like that. If there's language that doesn't allow that to happen, or the opposite, if you like, then you're stuck with it, even as the IP moves from one party to the next. So making sure that the language around how these are used, even if you can trace them, the traceability is probably the most simple step that you can take. But making sure that the language that put restrictions or limitations on the ability to use it is also the right language is a critical one. Over.
Okay.
I would agree with that, Kwasi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to build a little bit, if I could spring on that. I agree. And I think what we've talked about, and what we as a team have used in the past, is this sort of framework approach to a relationship. And noting that in each particular case, we'll need to put in some sort of sub-agreement to that, that fits within the framework, but addresses that particular piece of data, information, IP, whatever it is, given the variability of where that comes from and the rights and obligations therein, funders, DFIs, innovators and such. So I agree. And I think that's why we sort of approach it as a framework and then have these one-off additional agreements that have to be put in place to actually affect the transfer and the use of that and make sure it's customized in the way that it should be.
Thanks. Next question is coming from a country and builds on that. Can you touch on the onward sharing of materials and how to mitigate that in bilateral agreements? So this is important for negotiators.
Sorry, can you?
Shall I go slower? Can you? Sorry, I spoke too fast. I'm getting excited. Can you touch on onward sharing of materials and how to mitigate that in bilateral agreements?
I think I might know it if the person is asking, but again, if they can type in if we're on the right base here. I think, are you talking about the porousness of the potential pandemic agreement provisions, so that if materials are shared with particular parties and that's registered and they make certain obligations as participating manufacturers or other users, how you avoid having bilateral agreements go around that? I think that's what the question is. And I think that's very difficult. And I think what needs to be involved is incentives to go with the pandemic agreement system, so that if the materials are transferred to a user, there is a benefit of developing those and licensing them transparently to to a manufacturer that has agreed to be a participating manufacturer. So in other words, what kinds of incentives can you make at the different systems so that they want to stay within that system? I think it is much harder to, and probably unavoidable that some companies are going to be able to get access to these materials. Some countries are going to enter into these framework agreements where, in a sense, their companies could have an advantage, speed advantage of getting it sooner, government incentive advantage to having what they do to develop it funded going forward. So I think that is something for the negotiators to consider, is what do you build into this so that going through the system, which in some ways can create a guaranteed market down the road for purchasers to acquire these pandemic products in a way that it builds a sustainable business model for companies in different countries in the world. So do tell us if that was not the answer you were looking for.
I'll give some time for a reaction to that. In the meantime, Tom and Kwasi, do you want to come in on this point, or shall I put the next question to you?
I have something slightly tangential to that, if the right time to talk about it. And that is, talking about traceability, the use of these IPs as they move from one part to the other. I think one of the measures that negotiated needs to be looking at are specific performance outcomes. So as you sign these exchanges, whether it's data, whether it's material, what are the outcomes that a country is looking for when this has happened, all said and done, and whether it's the short term or long term. And I think it's always helpful. You may not get to the fine details, but progressively, if you could, to make sure that both sides are very clear-eyed on what the outcomes should be, so that you can go back and measure, if you like, whether you're on track or not. And I think I glanced very quickly, the Kenyan agreement or the framework, I'm not sure which one, does touch on this. And I think it's a very good example for others to look at.
Thank you. Start with the outcomes in mind. A question from Austin Liu, and it's a long question, so I'll read it slowly. The speakers have touched on key terms related to IP, price, volume, license, tech transfer, information sharing, liability, and enforceability in different types of agreements. Considering the growing number of agreements that cover such issues, what level of transparency of these terms is practical and feasible and would serve the purpose to benefit countries and funders negotiating or renegotiating subsequent agreements with the ultimate objective of achieving global equitable access?
Hi, Austin.
Hi, Austin. Yeah.
So since you all know each other, go.
Well, I'll give it a go. I think
Sure.
this is always a challenge, because of confidentiality clauses that can be written into some of these agreements, and other safeguards, which are in some cases also, quite important for one party or the other. And therefore, you cannot get rid of them entirely. And I think what you seek to do is to approach the ideal as much as you can. I think it is also important that other organizations, civil society organizations, other public funders should also be part of the conversation and stress the point of the importance of transparency and sharing of information and what does overall to the ecosystem. But there will always be protections that bilaterals seek that in some cases, if not carefully considered, could put severe limitations on ability to be transparent about what you have. So it's a challenge, but we just have to keep, knocking at it, and hopefully we'll make headway. I think that's what I would share on this, and I hope that others have something more to add.
I would agree, Kwasi, and I think the way we've approached it in the past is to consider the nature of the funding coming to organizations and such being public funds, things being public goods, and therefore leaning into transparency, to Austin's question. So we've leaned into it quite a bit in some cases and met resistance for the reasons you mentioned, Kwasi. I am encouraged, though, looking at the Kenyan agreement with the United States as an example. There's a provision to be able to share this agreement publicly. That's a wonderful thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a start. And I think we need much more of that as we go forward in order to create trust within. I talk about system all the time, right? But create trust within the system, and you do that through transparency.
Thanks. Julie, you want to
All
pitch
right.
in?
Sure. I'm in the business, if you will, of sharing agreements. So I will say, and I will put a link in there for those of you that are interested, where in the MAP guide we discuss transparency and confidentiality clauses. I think traditionally, and as a sort of recovering lawyer, I will say that lawyers, when involved, will tend to keep everything confidential. It's a knee-jerk reaction. I think what all of the negotiators need to think about is what is outside that. So, for instance, with funders, we've been pushing that funding terms around equitable access should be publishable in their funding agreements, because how else is the practice, if you will, going to proceed. And I think that's true also with these agreements where companies are also making products for public health, for global public health. What is not business sensitive, and pushing on that, because I think, especially in these negotiations, it's great that this initial framework agreement has been shared, because everyone that is negotiating their own agreements can build on that, what works for them and what doesn't work for them. So I think if everybody continues to sort of push that, and if funders and civil society and those that are actually negotiating terms within the treaty can push at what needs to be shared, so that we know who's developing what in general, who is intending to supply how much to public health in general at the other end of the spectrum, then it's easier for everyone in the system to make sure that their agreement meets their needs. Thanks.
Thanks. Question that goes to precedence of law. So, Julie, I think this is directed to you first. Given what we see from the current WHO PABS Annex and the US Memorandum of Understanding with Kenya, which one takes precedence in the national law? This is from Moga Kamalyani.
There's probably an international law professor on here that can answer this much better than I can. So the treaties have to be adopted by national governments and written into law before they actually impact that country's law. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. It's, great if the treaty is ratified and adopted, but it actually has to turn into national law. One of the things that I think confuses both the language and some of the discussions is that the treaty does impact countries directly, but the fact that it becomes law in those countries will impact the companies and organizations, universities within those countries. So again, sort of order of, until it is actually written into national law, it is not enforceable in any law within that jurisdiction. So hard to enforce a contract, for instance, if it is based on some provisions that are not adopted within that country. And again, hopefully that answered your question in general, but it is there's several steps before a treaty actually becomes part of a country's ability to enforce something with its company, or cross-country enforcement. Thanks.
Can I just take the liberty of appending something to that is actually live for countries? So most countries have adopted the international health regulations as amended in September 2024, right? And they became live in September 25. So to the extent that the IHRs and PABs and any bilaterals overlap, and I know you're not an international lawyer, but how might those then interact with each other? Let's look at the IHRs versus, say, the bilateral.
So the IHR actually exists and is adopted by most countries. I think it's most now, not the US, by the way, of course, even though it pushed for it. So I think perhaps you have to take what is fixed, that, and then as actually the negotiators are already doing, holding up the sort of potential PABS provisions and pandemic agreement provisions to see whether they are in compliance. And I think several people have written some good pieces on how that works together. These bilateral agreements are going to need to be, for the countries that have signed up to the IHR, compatible with that. Again, for the US, that is not the case because it has not adopted the IHR. So they, will have no particular interest in making sure they're in compliance with it. And it's going to be up to the individual country, if their country has signed the IHR, to make sure that they are not agreeing something that is in violation of their own laws. And again, there's a couple of good agreements, and I'll try to send them to you later spring so you can share, if people haven't, a couple of good articles on trying to align IHR pandemic agreement. And since every framework agreement is slightly different, it is quite a task to then compare that agreement to the IHRs, and then adding on to that pandemic agreement provisions when those are adopted. Thanks.
Thanks. Just to answer the question in the chat, no, the US did not adopt the updated IHR. I think there are a few countries, Argentina and Italy may be among them, but I think there's about 5 countries that have not done that. Kwasi or Tom, did you want to comment on that particular question or no?
No, not from me.
Okay, Tom, go ahead.
I would just offer from, again, the initial review of the US-Kenyan agreement, there is provision. It actually says that the framework is expected to be carried out consistently with applicable law and the relevant rules and regulations of the government of Kenya and the United States government. So to Julie's point, something that's been accepted and ratified by the country would drive how this is interpreted and implemented as a framework agreement.
Thanks. I'm just going to check and see if there are any other questions from the audience. I see none. So perhaps I can ask each of you to sort of give a short reflection on, and you all laughed at me yesterday when I posed this question in our discussion, but I will still put it to you for the benefit of our audience. If there were one practice that each of you would implement tomorrow to make agreements achieve what you intend, what would that be? Kwasi, maybe I'll start with you first.
Well, since I can only pick one, I'll just talk about the importance of consultations, especially in the context which we are discussing, because I have lived this where these discussions do take place at a level that doesn't take into account the practical realities of those who will live it. And we talked earlier on about, how companies would operate within such a framework. I'm a strong proponent of local innovation and indeed leveraging that innovation. And I think consultation between governments, civil society, and indeed these innovators and companies is a critical element as these negotiations go on, whether be it the PAPS itself, whether it be bilaterals of any kind. It's critical that those consultations do take place internal to the countries, but also more importantly, in the specific context of Africa, the regional bodies and the sub-regional bodies. So the AU itself, the ECOWASs and the rest of them within the region. It's important that you are able to stand together because a lot of the work that has been done within the ecosystem of health in Africa has been regionally based. And a lot of it's in infancy. It's infancy. And I think making sure that those things are not in any way impeded by agreements that are signed is very, very important. We've seen how the Africa CDC, in a very short span of time, has enabled a number of conversations. Some are still ongoing, but I think the ability to preserve the evolution of this for the sake of the region is important. Obviously, countries' interests come first, but the balancing act of making sure that you can operate within the two, it's a critical one. Just to give a practical example, for instance, no individual country, and certainly within the African context, can produce all the vaccines that they require and have it be a feasible business model. And therefore, regional cooperation is very, very important. And your ability to make sure that this can continue as you negotiate these agreements will be one of the key pieces of advice that I would give to those who are at the forefront of it. Over.
Thanks, Kwasi. That's very clear. Tom?
I think in a similar vein, but very simple statement. And again, those that know me have heard this before. Begin with the end in mind. Take the perspective of what you want out of this, whether you're the AU, a country, an innovator, the US. What does this look like in the end? And how do you make it sustainable in order to achieve that and incorporate that into the design and the operation of the system and the agreements that then support that. So again, very simply, begin with the end in mind.
Thanks. Very clear. Julie, last word.
Well, not surprisingly, Tom stole my point, so I will build on it.
Okay.
All three of us, by the way, in case you haven't guessed, are fundamentally negotiators. So we think about this always from that perspective. So I will say align, align, align. First of all, align what your country wants. I know in some cases there are people in Geneva negotiating the treaty, and there are people back in the capitals of countries trying to negotiate these MOUs. Align, and within your country, you will have more strength and more ability to resist and to make sure you get in there, again, to Tom's point, what your goals are. Because you need to take the time, even in this very rushed period, to figure out what is your negotiating strategy. What is it you really want? What are your goals that end in mind? What is it that you're willing to give up? Because there will be things that you need to give up. And then join in with your fellow continent countries and come up with a way to build leverage, things that you must all have, things that you all will not agree. And so align to reach your goals. You'll build leverage, and you will keep yourselves from going sort of off course as you negotiate these various things. You need a plan. So I don't know, align and get a plan. That was 2 points. Sorry, Spring.
That's fine. Fair enough. Align, 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 get a plan, begin with the end in mind, consult widely at the national, regional, and continental level, stand together. Only so can we serve the interests of access to health for all. I want to thank all three of my panelists for this discussion today. You have been phenomenal. To my audience, thank you very much for staying, for your very interesting questions around the contracts. Our PABS series includes courses that we offer in the PABS in Practice Sprint. There is a QR code there. There will be a course on contracts and negotiations that will be led by these wonderful people here and bring in other experts. There is also a course that is strictly related to implementing a treaty at home that is given by leaders who come from the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, among others. And so we hope to continue these discussions. We hope you will continue to join us. We hope you will expand your knowledge by taking advantage of the expertise of Julia and Tom and Kwasi. And we look forward to seeing you again in January. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Spring and all.